Okay, today we're going to talk about post-structuralism, but before we move to the topic itself, please have a look at the screen once again and think of whether you know the answers to all of these questions that we were trying to cover during the previous meeting. If you have some doubts or uncertainties or problems answering just any of them, please go back to lecture 2 and watch it once again. And if there is no problem, then let's probably move further. And today we've got post-structuralism, and that's I'm going to give you a brief plan of this lecture. We will start with some theoretical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism, and then we will talk about the emergence of the latter and about some key figures of the movement. Then we will talk about the main method of post-structuralism, which you have probably heard of, and which is called deconstruction. And of course, we will talk a little bit about what post-structuralist critics do. And in the end, we will try to do a little exercise and try to deconstruct some well-known texts ourselves. So post-structuralism, of course, you have heard about this movement. And the first question which arises when we talk about it is whether it's a continuation of structuralism or that is rather in opposition to that. Well, to a certain point, it's both, because they take some key points of structuralism and they lead them to the extreme. And that's a well-known fact that if we take some movement or some direction or some approach or tendency and lead it to the extreme, at a certain point it will start denying itself. Okay, what I mean? Post-structuralists, they would take this structuralist idea that language doesn't just reflect or record the world, rather it shapes it. The essence of the things is not inside the things themselves. It is we who give meanings to the things, and after that, objects, notions, they start actually existing and they start shaping the world because we've got the word for that. For example, we all know that there are 7 colors in the rainbow, right? But, oh, well, why 7? Haven't you ever asked yourself, why are there 7 colors in the rainbow? I mean, that's a spectrum. Why not 17? Why not 77? Why not 177? This is because we agreed that, good, we will have 7 colors in the rainbow. And after we've done that, we start seeing those 7 colors. Or I have a great example of my own. For example, I have a hobby, and in my free time, I paint a little bit. I started doing that rather late, when I was in my 20s already. And okay, before that, when I saw brown color, it was just brown color for me. Okay, this is black, this is red, this is brown. That's basically it. But after I started going deeper and deeper into that, I started seeing different browns, like raw umber and burnt umber and raw sienna and burnt sienna and all those things, because I've got the title, because I've got the name for that. You've got the name, you've got an object in reality, not vice versa. Or another great example, in some culture in the North, they have 15 or so words to denote white color. I mean, for me, white color is just white color, and that's it. And for them, they have 15 different words. And I bet they have 15 different whites. Because again, you see the word, you've got the word, then you've got an object in reality. And so what post-structuralists say? They say, okay, yeah, we will probably agree with this idea, but what does that really mean? That means that we enter a universe of radical uncertainty. Because after we assume that, after we assumed that thing about language, we stopped knowing where right is, where left is, where the top is, where the bottom is, because we do not have a fixed system of coordinates anymore. It's like when you're sitting in a train, which is standing on the platform, and there's another train outside the window, and then that letter starts moving. And have you ever had this feeling that for some time you are not sure whether that's your train moving or whether that's a neighboring train moving? And then when the other train finally leaves and you again see the platform, which is a fixed system of coordinate, right? Then you again understand that, oh, it was that train which was moving, not ours. Or to change the analogy, it's like you are in the open space where there is no gravity. And this is what post-structuralists say about our world, about our reality. Well, that may probably seem too much for you, because we all manage to live somehow till our 20s or our 30s or the age we are now. And we all use language, right? We all use language to communicate, to do our everyday things, our everyday routines. We go to the university, we learn with the help of language. We produce something with the help of language. But try to stop here for a moment and try to think about any situation which slightly goes beyond the measures of your everyday routine. For example, you have to know, you want to make friends at a party with a person you do not know yet. Or you need to write a letter to your bank. Or you need to talk to the director of your university. Don't you think you will have that feeling of radical uncertainty, the feeling of anxiety? What do I have to say? Which word do I have to use that? Did he get me right? Or even better, after you had some kind of conversation with anyone, you leave and you go home and you continue thinking, oh, I shouldn't have said that. He has probably got me wrong. I shouldn't have done that. No, I didn't mean that. I mean, this is what we usually face with when we use language in our everyday communications. You are never sure 100% that people get you right, that people get the message. And this is what postmodern writers would usually use in their writing and would usually talk about. For example, Thomas Pynchon's Entropy, one of his characters in the text, he's talking about the situation when you're telling a girl, I love you. And he says, okay, no trouble with the 2/3 of that. It's a closed circuit. Just you and she, right? I and you. But that nasty 4-letter word in the middle, which is love, that's the one you have to look out for. Ambiguity, redundancy, irrelevance even, leakage. Well, really, when you tell somebody, I love you, and you're trying to convey some kind of feeling, some kind of a message, how can you be sure they get you right? How can you be sure they understand the word love the same way you do? Post-structuralists say you cannot be ever sure in that. Post-structuralism assumes that you understand those things differently. I love you one is not equal to I love you two. So that's why, in its essence, post-structuralism is seeking to show the weakness of language to convey meanings. Or even broader, it is seeking to show the weakness of any system or structure to have a fixed meaning in itself. That means that it's not only that they are certain that language is not working and any system is not, unified and cannot have a fixed structure. It is that they necessarily want to assure you that they are right. They necessarily want to impose this thinking on you. And this is actually that's the basic idea of post-structuralism. Okay, if we compare post-structuralist writing to structuralist writing, structuralism derives from linguistics. And linguistics is a very logical discipline. It's confident about the possibility of establishing objective knowledge. That's why structuralism inherits this confidently scientific outlook. On the contrary, post-structuralism derives from philosophy of relativism. If you do not remember what philosophy of relativism is, basically it's about the idea that each of us has their own truth. And before that, we knew for sure that this is right, this is wrong, this is true, this is false. And relativism says that, well, that all depends on the angle you're looking at the problem. Sometimes that may be true, sometimes that may be false. From some position, this is right. From the other position, this is wrong. I mean, that all depends. And this is what post-structuralism grows from. And hence, it inherits the habit of skepticism and it intensifies it. It regards any confidence in the scientific method as naive and even derives a certain, masochistic intellectual pleasure in knowing for certain that we cannot know anything for certain. Good. Number two, if talking about tone and style, post-structuralism aims for a detached scientific coolness of the tone. Post-structuralism, on the contrary, tends to be much more emotive, much more expressive, and in their headings, the titles of their works would usually contain puns and allusions and some word playing and all those things. Attitude to language. Structuralism accepts that the world is constituted through language, but nevertheless, it decides to live with that fact and it decides to continue use language to think and perceive with. Well, after all, language is an orderly system, not a chaotic one. And we've got what we've got. Yeah, this is not the perfect system, but this is what we have. We have to learn to use it somehow and understand it somehow and structure the world with the help of this system somehow. So this is basically what we have. We have to use it. On the contrary, post-structuralism, it develops terminal anxiety about the possibilities of achieving any knowledge through language. Again, the structuralists say, this is not the perfect, but this is what we have. We have to learn to live with it. Structuralists say, it's not working. Why even trying? Let us play with that. Let's make fun about it. And that leads us to the fundamental aims of each movement. Structuralism questions the way of structuring and categorizing reality. But why do they do that? Only because they are sure that with the help of that, we can attain a more reliable view of things. On the contrary, post-structuralists, they distrust the very notion of reason. And the idea of human being as independent reality is not working for them. They view the individual as a product of social and linguistic forces. If you remember what liberal humanism was about, it's directly opposite to what they said, because for liberal humanists, our identity, our personality was something deeply hidden inside us. Is something we possessed before the context or before the discourse. Okay, so post-structuralism, the movement itself, it emerges in the late 1960s in France. And the two figures which are most closely associated with this movement are Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida. We already talked about Roland Barthes, who you can see now on the screen, when we were talking about structuralism. That's what happens to lots of structuralist, post-structuralist critics. They just moved from structuralist position to post-structuralist. In 1968, there came a crucial essay by Roland Barthes, which was called The Death of the Author, which is the hinge around which Barthes turns from structuralist position to post-structuralist. And in that essay, he announces the death of the author, which is a rhetorical way of asserting the independence of literary text and its immunity to the possibility of being limited by any notion of what the author might have intended or meant. If putting it simply, somewhere around 60s, all literary studies shift an angle from which they look at the text. Before that, the text was thought to convey or to contain a certain fixed meaning, whether implied by the author or identified through language means or literary devices, etc., etc. But that was a true meaning contained by the text and hidden inside the text, which the critic was supposed to find out. After the 60s, the accents were shifted to the way we might read a text. Before that, the critics studied the meaning of the text. After that, the critics actually studied the reader's possible reaction. This is why Barthes, when speaking about the death of the author, he also speaks about the birth of the reader. That all goes from this scheme. Again, when, for example, I want to tell somebody something, I want to convey some kind of meaning or some kind of a message. And I've got an implied meaning one, but I cannot do telepathy, right? So I have to code this meaning to transmit it to the recipient. I've got to code somehow this meaning, and I would probably code into a verbal or cultural sign, if that's a text or a literary text or a ballet or a musical or a piece of music or whatever. And then the recipient will have to decode somehow this meaning. And only after decoding, they have meaning number two, which the recipient gets. And meaning number one, which is implied meaning, is never equal to the meaning the recipient gets. Again, like with that idea about I love you, I have some kind of a feeling, I have to code it into this sentence consisting of 3 words, I love you. And then the listener decodes it and gets the meaning, which is not equal to what I actually meant. And this is what Barthes says about literary text. The second key figure in the development of post-structuralism is Jacques Derrida in 1960s. You have probably heard about him, and you can now see him on the screen. He is also a French philosopher, just as Roland Barthes, and they work basically at the same time. It's not that Barthes was before and Derrida was later. So what does he say and what does he do? Derrida says in modern times a particular intellectual event which constitutes a radical break from past ways of thinking and understanding the world. And he would loosely associate this break with the philosophy of Nietzsche. Again, why Nietzsche? Because we're talking about the extension of philosophical relativism, and Nietzsche is probably the first figure we would recollect when speaking about the philosophy of relativism in modern times, at least. It's not that he was the first to start thinking relatively, but he is probably the most bright figure to think about when talking about philosophical relativism. This event for Derrida, it concerns the decentering of our intellectual universe. Prior to this event, the existence of a norm or a center in all things was taken for granted. Just as the Renaissance slogan had it, man was the measure of all things. But these were mainly white Western men and white Western norms of dress and behavior, architecture, intellectual look, and intellectual outlook, and so on and so on. And Derrida criticizes the entire tradition of Western philosophy's search to discover the essential structure of knowledge and reality, which ultimately confronts the limits of human thought. As an extension of this theory of logocentrism, Derrida posits that all texts are based on hierarchical dualisms. Like being and non-being, white and black, reality and appearance, male and female, where the first element is regarded as stronger and thus essentially true. And Derrida says all systems of thought have an assumed center, have this system of coordinates, and he says that this is what all systems of thoughts are based on. In the 20th century, however, these centers are destroyed. This happens because of many reasons. Sometimes it is caused by historical events, such as the First World War destroyed the illusion of steady material progress, or the Holocaust destroyed the notion of Europe as the center and the source of human civilization. And sometimes that happens because of scientific events, like the notion of relativity destroyed the ideas of time and space as fixed central absolutes. So, I mean, there cannot be one factor to influence most the changes in outlook. Usually there is a combination of lots of factors, political, economical, outlook, scientific, and so on and so forth. But we have what we have. In the middle of the 20th century, there is a shift in the outlook to destroy the centers, to destroy the system of coordinates. And this is what I started this lecture with. Western world, or living in a Western world, is now reminding living in the outer space with no gravity, without fixed system of coordinates. And the world we live in has become inherently relativistic. And instead of movement or deviation from a known center, we now have a free play of meaning, forms, surfaces, structures, understanding, concepts, and so on and so forth. The practical method of post-structuralism is called deconstruction, and it is often referred to as reading against the grain, or reading the text against itself, with the purpose of knowing the text as it cannot know itself. That was the definition of Terry Eagleton. Please note that deconstruction is not synonymous to destruction. These are totally different notions. It is, in fact, much closer to the original meaning of the word analysis, which etymologically means to undo. And James Cudden, in his Dictionary of Literary Terms, asserts that in deconstruction, a text can be read as saying something quite different from what it appears to be saying. That it subverts what may be seen by criticism as single, stable meaning. And in this text, in this way, the text betrays itself. So deconstruction is reading with the aim of unmasking the internal contradictions of the text, or inconsistencies of the text, which aims to show the inherent disunity of the text. And if we compare what post-structuralists do with the text to what structuralists were doing with the same texts, we will see that when structuralist critics were trying to look for parallels and echoes in the text, post-structuralists are rather more concentrated on finding contradictions and paradoxes, breaks in tone rather than balances. If the structuralist thought aimed to find the reflections and repetitions in the text, structuralist point of view would rather aim to find some conflicts, or absences or omissions, or linguistic quirks, or aporias. Why do they do that? Again, their aim is to show the textual disunity. That will become probably clearer if we talk a little bit about what we have to do in order to deconstruct a text, a so-called manual for deconstruction, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So number one, what do you have to do? You have to oppose the prevailing wisdom. The only assumption you can make is that the meaning of the text is unstable, and what others have told you about the text, for example, your teachers at school, your teachers at the university, very, very famous literary critics, the authors themselves, is based only on their own assumptions. So from now on, you are free to do with the text whatever you'd like to. and to look at it from whatever angle you choose to be the most appropriate for you personally. For example, if you are deconstructing John Donne's Good Morrow, which begins, I wonder by my troth what you and I did till we loved, you cannot assume the poet is talking about a woman. What if the speaker of the poem is gay or being sarcastic about his ex-lover? You may play with this meanings, with these possible interpretations. I mean, you're absolutely free to do with the text whatever you like. Number two, expose cultural bias. Is the poet personifying everything in nature, say the sun, the moon, the sea, as being male? Well, if he does that, if they do so, that means you might conclude that the text has a male bias. Or if a novelist portrays white European culture as learned and sophisticated in contrast to other cultures in the world, you might suspect a Western Eurocentric bias in the text. Number three, analyze the sentence structure. And this is the other way to investigate the underlying meaning of a text. If a novel's male protagonist is always the initiator of action rather than the recipient, for example, he took her to the store, he bought her this, he bought her that, he brought her home, he has done this and this and that for her, whatever. That means that the recurrent structure reinforces the protagonist's power over the dependent character. And so number four, to conclude it somehow, play with possible meanings. Again, you are free to read the text in whatever way you like. You're free to apply to the text whatever theory you would like to apply to it. Okay, to understand clearer what I mean, let us try to apply those rules of deconstruction, which I was talking about before, to a very well-known fairy tale, or you might also take a Disney cartoon as a variant of that, Cinderella. Everybody knows Cinderella from the very childhood, right? And as you probably remember, it is about a woman who suffers a lot from a mean family consisting of her stepmother and two stepsisters, in a place which she believes to be her own house. She is really treated like a servant in her own house after her father's death. And this character is a role model of a typical woman who embraces simplicity, humility, and beauty. And Cinderella is actually a woman who sacrifices her own happiness, but in the hope of receiving some greater benefits. And if we were liberal humanists, we would, of course, read a very straightforward message about eternal values and moral lesson, and actually Christian moral values, which the fairy tale transmits. Modern literary critics, however, believe that Cinderella is a lame duck who depends primarily upon what others can do to her, for example, the fairy godmother. She lacks courage to assert herself. Well, after all, she could have stopped harassment long ago. Because, well, to speak honestly, a typical woman in the old world is not likely to survive in this challenging modern generation with such cowardice. And although the fairy tale provides a very clear moral lesson that simple, humble, and beautiful will be rewarded in the end, it doesn't give us a clear algorithm of how to achieve that in real action. Because Cinderella is truly a Disney story, and it carries a happy ending, and they lived happily ever after. But if we look at the real world, does every of us have a fairy godmother who will help us in any situation we need her? Probably no. And are there princes for every enslaved lady? I guess probably no. And the story is indeed about a character who is a helpless personality. In the real world, post-structuralist critics would probably say. Justice means punishing those who deserve to be punished. Or a post-structuralist critic would necessarily go further into the depth of Cinderella's morality model. Because, okay, the heroine seems to be a carrier of a Christian model, faith, hope, humility, modesty, simplicity. But on the other hand, in the Christian world, forgiveness is a key thing. And if you turn to Disney variant of this fairy tale, you would see that Cinderella shows no sign of forgiveness. She just marries Prince Charming, and that's it. A post-structuralist critic would necessarily think about what is going to happen to Cinderella and Prince Charming after the happy end. Because do you still remember that they've been known each other for like several hours? And he fell in love with her just because of her appearance. He actually knew nothing about the character. And was it really true love? Again, the characters didn't know anything about each other. We might also ask a question about who wins in this story, because as a child, we thought Cinderella definitely won. And the evil stepmother and stepsisters, they lost. But in reality, Cinderella didn't really win because, well, Prince Charming doesn't actually fall in love with her. He falls in love with her beauty. And that's why Cinderella lived happily ever after. Not because Prince Charming loved her, but because she was beautiful. And that's it. And probably the one who wins was Prince Charming, because he got what he wanted. He got the girl he wanted. And he didn't have to work hard for that. And again, that will lead us to asking further and further questions based on gender roles in this story, and so on and so forth. We may think about the gender roles enforced by this fairy tale. In this case, the deconstruction will entangle the feminist criticism, which also starts from deconstruction, from post-structuralism, with the idea that there is no fixed center anymore or system of coordinates anymore. Cinderella enforces gender roles by portraying women in a negative way. Cinderella portrays women to be weak, obedient, and passive. What does she have to do? Her only task is to be a good girl, to be humble, obedient, good, and to hope. And if she's good enough, she will be rewarded. Rewarded by getting him, Prince Charming. And it makes beauty and wealth an important thing in society in a way for happiness. And this is not the last thing which causes gender roles to remain what they are in our society. And I would like to finish this lecture by trying to deconstruct Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait, which we already tried to analyze through the point of view of liberal humanism and Russian formalism and structuralist point of view. So now let us try to imply the deconstruction approach to this text. And the first thing we might probably ask is whether the wife was really a victim or not. Because let us turn to the text and see what Poe says about her. He says that despite her lively and lovely spirit, the wife was full of glee, which will probably tell us that she's not of the subservient type. Rather, she's a subversive character, refusing subordination in a competition. Because, again, the author of the text says that she was hating only the art which was her rival. And if the art was her rival, then that means that she was in a kind of a competition with that art. And maybe it was partially on purpose that even with a character like hers, she chooses the role of the uncomplaining victim. Maybe it was partially on purpose in order to lay blame on her husband, in order to manipulate him. Maybe she's of a sadomasochistic character who causes pain for her husband by receiving her own benefits. Number two, there is obviously an opposition of art and life in the text, or at least this is what might seem to us at first sight. But if we look at the text from the structuralist point of view, we might probably think that the whole dichotomy of art and life is originated by wife herself. And life and art, they do not stand in stark contrast against each other, but rather life becomes meaningful through art when involved in it. At least that's what happens with the artist. Number three, we've got an opposition of art and delirium. And from this point of view, we might even ask whether the whole story really took place. Maybe it was because of morpheus or opium or other drugs which he was using to relieve pain. Maybe nothing has ever happened. And the whole story could be the production of his imagination. I mean, the story is open to numerous ways of reading from different angles, and we as post-structuralist readers can really do with the text whatever we like and apply whatever theories we want to that text. So this was the rough outline of what post-structuralism really is and what deconstruction is about. If you have some free time, try to play with different texts which are very familiar to you, maybe some pieces of world literature, and think of the possible meanings which these texts might probably convey, obviously not seen by the authors themselves, and meanings which are hidden in the texts. Okay, thank you for watching this lecture, and see you next week.